Here is the 401k Future Value Calculator page. It is an ASP.NET web form application that calculates the future value of a fixed monthly investment. The web form contains 6 web server controls, a drop-down list, 2 text boxes, 1 label, and 2 buttons. The drop-down list can be used to select a monthly investment value ranging from 50 to 500 in increments of 50. The initial value is set to 50. We're going to select a monthly investment of $100. The 2 text boxes are used to enter values for the annual interest rate and the number of years. Notice that these text boxes have the initial value set, but we're going to enter 6.9 as our interest rate, and we'll leave the number of years to 10. The label, which is currently empty, is used to display the future value that is calculated. When you click the Calculate button, the application calculates the future value based on the 3 user entries. A post back to the server occurs, the processing is then done, and when the form is returned back to the browser, the result is displayed in the label, as you can see here. When you click the Clear button, the text boxes and the label are cleared, and the value in the drop-down list is reset to its initial value of 50. In the next section, we're going to take a look at the ASP.NET code for this web form. Here is the Future Value Calculator web form in Visual Studio. We are going to view it in split view, so we can see the web form design view in the bottom pane and the ASPS code in the source view at the top. If you look in the source view, you'll see the HTML form tag which makes up the web form. The Run at Server indicates that the form will be processed on the server by ASP.NET. Let's look at some of the controls now. Here is the drop-down list control. You'll notice in the Properties window that it has been given the name DDL Monthly Investment. The values in the drop-down list are added programmatically, and we'll see that very soon. The ASPX code for the control is highlighted in the code view above. The Run at Server code indicates that the control will be processed on the server by ASP.NET, so therefore it is a server control. Now let's look at the annual interest rate text box. It is named TXT interest rate. Its text property has been set to 6, so it's the default value. Here's the ASPX code for the control, and it is also a server control. The number of years text box has been named TXT years. Its text property has been set to 10, so it's its default value. Here is the ASPX code for the control, which is also a server control. Now we'll look at the label control. Its name is LBL Future Value. Its text property is initially blank, but it will set to the future value that will be calculated when we click on the Calculate button. The Calculate button control has been named BTN Calculate. When the user clicks this button, the click event of the control is raised. Then the page is posted back to the server. The event handlers for the init and load events of the page are executed. We'll see this soon. Followed by the event handler for the click event of the control that was clicked. The event handler for the click event is named in the code onClick button calculate click, right here. This means that the code in the button calculate click event handler will execute when this button is clicked. This code can be found in the code behind file, which we'll see soon. Now let's look at the Clear button. Its name is Button Clear. When clicked, the code in the button clear_click event in the handler will execute. You can see it here on click. You'll also notice, you may notice, there are some additional controls on the bottom of the page that are not initially visible when viewed in the browser. These are the validation controls. In this web form, there are 4 validators that have been added. 2 required field validators and 2 range validators. Although these controls aren't displayed when the form is displayed, the messages in their error message properties are displayed if errors are detected. The validation is typically performed when the focus leaves the control that's being validated, and also when the user clicks on a button whose cause validation property is set to true. When ASP.NET performs the validation tests, it sets the isValid property of each validator to indicate if the test was successful. It also sets the isValid property of the page itself to indicate if all the input data is valid. Let's look at these validation controls. The first required field validator checks that a value has been entered in the text box for the interest rate. If you notice in the Properties window, the control to validate property is set to the TXT interest rate. That's our text box. The error message property has been set to interest rate is required, and the for color has been set to red. These properties and their values are also shown in the ASPX code for the validation control, which is currently highlighted. Let's look at the next range validator. Interest rate must range from 1 to 20. The first range validator checks that the value entered for the interest rate is a number that ranges from 1 to 20. The control to validate is TXT interest rate, and the error message property has been set to interest rate must range from 1 to 20. The maximum value is set to 20, and the minimum value is set to 1. The for color property is also set to red. The type property is set to double, which allows for decimal numbers. The number of years required. This is the second required field validator, and it checks that a value has been entered in the text box for the number of years. You can see the control to validate is set to TXT years, and the error message property has been set to number of years required. The second range validator checks that the value entered for the number of years is a number between 1 and 45. The control to validate property is set to TXT years. The error message property has been set to years must range from 1 to 45. The maximum value has been set to 45, and the minimum value has been set to 1. The type property is set to integer, since this should only be whole numbers. Next, let's run the application again and see these validators in action. Let's now run the application and look at these validators in action. If you remember, we had a required field validator and a range validator for the annual interest rate and the number of years. The annual interest rate is defaulted at 6.0. Let's now make it 9. And we'll tab away from it. It's within the valid range. But if I set it to 0 and tab away from it, it tells me that the interest rate must be from 1 to 20. If I have no value in there and I click calculate, it will tell me that the interest rate is required. This is the required field validator. So we'll put in an interest rate of 9.0 and we'll tab to the number of years. Let's try putting in nothing in that field again. Here's my required field validator in action. It tells me that the number of years is required for this text box. I believe our range was 45. Let's put in 88 years and tab away. It tells me that the years range must be from 1 to 45. So we'll put in 45 years click the Calculate button, it calculates the future value. Let's now look at the code behind. The code behind consists of 3 event handlers that handle the load event for the page and the click events for the Calculate and Clear buttons. Here's my page load event, the button for the Calculate click, and the Clear button. It also has a method named Calculate Future Value that is called by the event handler for the click event of the Calculate button. Let's now take a closer look at each of these events. Each time the page is requested, the ASP.NET initializes the page and raises the load event, which is handled by the page load method. This method uses the isPostback property of the page to determine whether the page is being loaded for the first time, in which case the isPostback property is set to false, or is being loaded as a result of a postback, in which case the isPostback property is true. If it is not a postback, that is, if the page is being loaded for the very first time, the values 50 through 500 are added to the drop-down list in increments of 50 using a for loop. So if it is not a postback, here's your for loop. Starts at 50, increments by 50 each time until it's greater than or equal to 500. And here's the add that value to my drop-down list. For all subsequent requests by that user, it is a postback, so the values aren't added again to the drop-down list. The button Calculate Click method is executed when the Calculate button is clicked. It first checks the isValid property to make sure that the data entered by the user is correct. Recall that this property is set by the validation controls. If isValid is true, it means that all of the data input is valid. But if isValid is false, this means that one or more of the controls contain invalid input data, so the processing shouldn't be done. If isValid is true, the button Calculate Click method uses the selected value property of the drop-down list to get the values of the selected item, which represents the investment amount, and converts it and stores it as an integer. Then it gets the interest rate and years values from the text boxes and converts them and stores them as decimal and an integer respectively. Next, it converts the interest rate and years values to monthly units. Last, it calls the Calculate Future Value method to calculate the future value, uses the toString method to convert the future value to a string with currency format, and puts the formatted value in the label of the form. When this method ends, the web form is sent back to the user's browser. Here's the call to the Calculate Future Value. Here's putting the calculated value, formatted calculated value, back in the label. The Calculate Future Value takes 3 methods: an integer for the monthly investment, a decimal for the interest rate, monthly interest rate, and an integer for the months. Using a for loop, it cycles through each month and adds the compounded interest to the investment amount to calculate the future value. The future value is then returned. The button Clear Click method is executed when the Clear button is clicked. It resets the form, setting the value of the drop-down list back to 50 or selected index equals 0, and emptying the text boxes and label.